We're back with part 2 of lecture 21. We're picking up with our discussion of some of the downsides of suburbanization during the 1950s and 1960s. And my last point in the previous lecture was that when we see large numbers of wealthier citizens, middle-class citizens, abandoning many urban downtown areas and relocating physically miles and miles away into the suburbs, this represents a net loss of tax revenue for that particular city. That means the city now has less money to pay firefighters who are slower to respond as a result of lack of support from the city. This results in police officers now, there's not enough of them to adequately police or patrol areas, so crime starts to spike in certain areas. There's no money for to fix roads, so potholes start to set in. Businesses start to relocate as well because of a loss of customers to suburban areas. This results in higher unemployment. Put all these things together and you start to see that when many middle-class white Americans are leaving some of these urban regions during the 1950s and 60s, that those who were left behind literally are experiencing a worse quality of life as a result. I want to spend a few minutes also talking about women's changing roles during the 1950s and 60s. And we're going to see a lot of tension between women's roles as they are portrayed in movies and on TV, what Hollywood presents women as doing during this period, and what the reality is for many women. This tension stems from the fact that if you turn on My Three Sons or Leave It to Beaver, you see a woman who remains in the home, a suburban middle-class home. Her home is always meticulously cleaned. She's there as a helpmate for her husband and a good and doting mother. For many working-class families, though, women could not stay home. The women work very hard at home, but they don't receive a salary for it. So for many working-class women, they needed everyone in the family to be outside of the home earning a wage. So women are increasingly working in factories. They're working in many sectors of the economy, even women that have school-aged children. You can see from the chart that I have here on the slide, the percentage of married women in the paid labor force only continues to rise during the 1950s and 60s, even among those who have children under the age of 6. So for these women, the reality is they're working long days. They're coming home and they're still working long days, taking care of the family, cooking, cleaning, and what have you. And they finally sit down in front of a TV and they look at this, perfectly made up woman on the screen that bears no real relationship to their actual day-to-day lives. Hollywood, in other words, continued to sort of pump into American culture the idea that women were best as wives and mothers, and Hollywood is very slow to catch on to the reality of the many challenges and difficulties that American women are facing during these decades. It didn't help either that the advertising industry also was like caught in a time warp. The advertising industry during the 1950s and 60s continued to market primarily to women as housekeepers and wives and mothers, and some of the advertising is just, shall we say, rather sexist. As you can see from this vitamin ad of the day, the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. Or wives, look over all these appliances and see what you want for Christmas. If he does not go to the store immediately, cry a little. Not a lot, just a little. He'll go get that toaster that you want so very badly. We'll also see that there's a high dropout rate for women attending college during the 1950s. Not because they don't have the intelligence to finish their degree, but instead they were encouraged to find a mate in college rather than actually finishing their curriculum and earning a degree. As one post-war textbook observed, quote, "Nothing is to be gained by women trying to imitate men," unquote, when it came to their schooling. Instead, the author continued on, urging women to focus on what was really important in college, landing a mate. Because, quote, "chances for marriage are greatly reduced if they do not make a permanent attachment during the college years," unquote. In other words, you went to college to get married, and then once you became married, that was when you achieved adulthood and recognition in the eyes of society. It's not surprising, therefore, with this focus on the part of Hollywood and the advertising industry to kind of really encourage women to be mothers and wives, that we see a strong demographic uptick in the United States. The birth rate is going to skyrocket after World War II. The so-called baby boom will be the result of millions of American servicemen coming back from service overseas, and they're ready to hunker down, right? They're ready to start a new life away from the horrors that they'd witnessed on the battlefield. And women were, expected to be right in line with this, and many of them were. So you can see the sharp uptick in the number of births each year, starting really in 1946 and holding high and steady. That is up until 1960. And what's very interesting about looking at this chart is it's not coincidental, it's not accidental, I should say, that around 1960 we start to see the birth rate plummet in the United States. And this is due to oral contraceptives. The first birth control pill becomes widely available by 1960, and you can see from this chart that when women are given control over their decision about when or even if they want to have children, that many of them will make the decision to delay motherhood or maybe to prevent it altogether. But there was a tremendous emphasis in the media on childbearing being a woman's job, just like it was a man's job to be a lawyer or a doctor. According to a 1956 edition of Life magazine, quote, "Of all the accomplishments of the American woman, the one she brings off with the most spectacular success is having babies," unquote. Yeah. Now we're going to start to see some critics of American culture by the late 1950s and early 1960s. I've already mentioned Lewis Mumford, the social commentator, and what he had to say about the fact that American homes were all the same, that, American citizens all seemed to be dressing the same and, being around people that were the same as them. What was happening to the concept of individuality in the United States? There are other critics of American mass culture that will take a very dim view of consumerism. They're going to look at all these magazine advertisements. They're going to look at all these television advertisements, trying to induce Americans to keep buying more and more goods, even if they couldn't afford it, even if they already had one of something. Why don't you want to buy a second one of something? Why don't you want to buy the newest version of a toaster or a television set? John Kenneth Galbraith will be one of the most outspoken critics of this kind of consumer-driven American culture, that we were being told to buy, and that would make us happy during this period. This economist and author of The Affluent Society, published in 1958, pointed out that even after Americans had satisfied their desires for TVs or automobiles or washing machines, that they were still being convinced by advertisers to buy more and more things so that their lives would be better, easier, more enviable. He also was very critical, especially in some of his later works, on the fallout of suburbanization, that Americans, if you turn on the TV, it looked like everyone was enjoying a greater quality of life during this period, but that was simply not true, especially for inner city residents. Yes, some people's lives were better, but in general, for many minorities who were being kept out of jobs, who were being denied loans to purchase homes in suburban areas, those that were of the working class that couldn't afford to purchase a better, fancier life outside these decaying inner cities, that these people were simply being left behind and ignored in American society. There's also a new musical style that will emerge, believe it or not, in part as a criticism against American society. This new musical style will be known as rock and roll music. There are many musical artists associated with this new upbeat type of musical style known as rock and roll. Elvis Presley kind of becomes the poster child for rock and roll, however, in the 1950s, and this is due to several different reasons, not least of which because for many young teenage girls, he becomes a sex symbol for them. He will be not just a performing artist, but he will star in a number of movies as well in the 1950s. And Presley's music really combined a number of black musical styles with white musical styles, and he'll add in his swinging hips. That there's a kind of a little bit of sexual tension attached to many of his live performances, and this earned him harsh recriminations among the older generation. They frowned upon this. They didn't like the lyrics. They did not like him swinging his hips in a suggestive manner, but for young audiences, they could not get enough of it. This whole genre of rock and roll music was really a way to rebel against what many teenagers felt like was kind of the stodgy, boring music of their parents and grandparents. Looking at the 1950s, we also need to understand that racism has not gone away. You wouldn't see it discussed on television or really much in the media, but it was very much a crippling issue for Mexican Americans, in particular in the Southwest, for African Americans throughout the entire country. They are being segregated into communities, and they are being overlooked for many jobs and loan applications. It's not a good thing that's going on during the 1950s, that you have this continuous stranglehold of segregation and discrimination against non-white communities throughout the country during the 1950s. Specifically, when we talk about the Jim Crow era in the South, one where you have mandated segregated schools, and many restaurants are segregated, all these things. That has not changed even after the Second World War, even after you have a large number of black soldiers who will serve honorably. Many of them will die on behalf of their country, and yet they still come back to a country that treats them as less than second-class citizens. However, it's going to be generational change that will be the major driver in setting up what becomes known as the Civil Rights era during the 1950s. What do I mean by generational change? I'm referring to the fact that you now have a younger group of black leaders emerging within the community, and many of those will be returning black veterans who are going to say, I did not lay my life on the line to defend the principles of democracy and freedom overseas, only to come back to my own country and be treated this way. So understand that you've got kind of an infusion of young leaders within the black community by the 1950s who are tired of gradualism. They are tired of being told, wait. Change will come. It's not going to come overnight, but just wait. They're saying no more. We're going to have to take stronger steps to try and alleviate this oppression and racism. Cold War tensions are also never far from the minds of all Americans, regardless of their ethnic background. Remember the concept of mutually assured destruction. The fact that at a moment's notice, that air raid sirens might go off in your town, and you're going to have to hunker down for likely a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. This is a fear that never goes away for Americans. This is a fear that is instilled in children at a very young age, because they undergo bomb drills in elementary schools during this period. You're told to get under your desk, and that would, I suppose, somehow magically prevent you from getting radiation poisoning or being incinerated due to a direct atomic attack. But everyone's thinking about this. Is constantly on people's minds. What would happen in the event of an atomic attack? So we have so-called doomsday preppers today. That's not new. By the 1950s, you have entire industries crop up in the United States just to try to assuage people's fears and get them prepared or prepped for surviving an atomic attack. So you have magazines, you have bomb shelters that people are buying and burying in their own backyards. This is clearly something that is haunting all Americans during this period, and it will for decades.